Hello and welcome to the podcast all about becoming a health coach. I'm Megan McCrory, an aspiring integrative nutrition health coach. Each week, I recap what I've learned at the Institute for Integrative Nutrition and how I'm applying it to my life. If this is your first time tuning in, I'm happy that you found the podcast and a very special welcome to you. You may want to go back and listen from the beginning to hear more about my health coaching journey. Let's dive right into week 9. This week's lesson, Module 8, focused on the understanding of the basics of fat and their effects on body, how inflammation plays a role in health and disease. We talk about real food versus industrial food, using food as medicine, the dairy debate that's going on. And lastly, we really talked about the area of creativity and how its impact on health and happiness. So there is a lot of good stuff this week. So let's get started with fat. Okay, fat is a macronutrient along with carbohydrates and protein. So these are the 3 micronutrients. You may hear this shortened to like macros when someone is talking about tracking their macronutrients. So all calories that you take into your body come in some combination of fat, carbohydrates, and protein. So not all fat is created equal. Let me dive into what the different kinds of fats are. First, there is monounsaturated fatty acids. These are the fats that support your good cholesterol, which is called HDL. Don't ask me what that was, and I didn't look it up. And it lowers the bad cholesterol, which is LDL. Monounsaturated fats are typically liquid at room temperature, and some examples of these are vegetable oil, avocado, nuts, and seeds. I think nuts and seeds actually have a lot of different fats in them, so you'll hear them again and again. The next kind of fat is called polyunsaturated fatty acids. These are also liquid at room temperature. And these contain what I think most people hear a lot about are the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And those are essential basically to our diet because we can't synthesize them ourselves. So there is a big difference between omega-3 and omega-6. We need them both, but we need them in the right ratio. So omega-3 fatty acids help to reduce inflammation. They support your heart health, and they reduce symptoms of depression and the risk of cancer. When your diet is higher in omega-6 and it doesn't have enough omega-3, so the ratio of those are off, this is shown to promote inflammation. And we're going to talk more about inflammation later on. But this is typically what we see in the standard American diet and other Western diets is the lack of omega-3 and the overabundance of omega-6. So you'll get your best omega-3s from fish, walnuts, flaxseed, canola oil, and chia seeds. But keep in mind that if for certain things you're going to want to have a lot more omega-3s. I'm going to talk about that later in the episode. So in order to get enough, everyone should really be taking a supplement, an omega-3 supplement. Later in the episode, I'll talk about the therapeutic quantities of omega-3 fatty acids for certain different types of ailments. This is interesting, though. The American diet gets most of their calories from corn oil and safflower oil, and those are 2 major sources of omega-6 fatty acids, and those are typically what people are frying in as well. Okay, let's move on to saturated fat. Now, these are generally solid at room temperature, so think coconut oil, think butter, right? Think lard, okay? Coconut oil is a plant-based source of saturated fat. So there's animal-based, so butter and lard, and plant-based. And coconut oil is a really great source of lauric acid, and it also has antibacterial and antifungal and cholesterol lowering properties. And as I mentioned in a previous episode, saturated fat kind of got a really bad rap in the 60s and 70s when a couple studies came out that showed that there was a link of saturated fat with a risk of cardiovascular disease and obesity. New studies, as well as people who are revisiting those old studies, are showing that not all saturated fats are equal. Not all saturated fats are harmful. And some can even be beneficial. So that's why, like eggs are good. No, eggs are bad. No, eggs are good. No, eggs are bad. That kind of debate that you get when you have studies that come out. So essentially, if you want to keep it clear or clean, it's stay away from synthetically saturated fats. Like naturally saturated fats are pretty good for you in moderate quantities. So that kind of brings up then the next kind of quote bad fat, which really is a bad fat. There is no good things about trans fats. And you might have heard trans fats because in 2013, the USDA removed trans fat from their list, the generally regarded as safe list. And so in 2013, and even sometime before then, a lot of companies were removing trans fats from their products. You might see trans fat free. And remember, this is removing added trans fats. So there could be trans fats from the processing, but they didn't add additional trans fats. So you got to watch what you're doing. Just stay away from processed foods. This is really the best way. Trans fats are also banned already in the EU. So if you're wondering if something has trans fats, you can look at the label. If it says partially hydrogenated, then it means there's probably trans fats inside. Fortunately, by the end of 2018, all the food companies in the US need to remove added trans fats from their products. So we're getting close to that deadline. Things like margarine, Crisco, fried foods, processed baked foods are examples where trans fats could be kind of like lurking around. Those are the major kinds of fat, or I should say most fat falls in those buckets. And we need fat. We need fat just like we need carbohydrates and we need protein. We need fat for proper absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. Fat also supports proper brain development and provides like cushioning, insulation to our organs. And it also really plays a big part in our hormone synthesis, which hormones and balancing hormones are a super important topic because hormones really run your body. Those are the chemical signatures that go through your body. And it also fat just keeps us satiated after a meal. So if you have a meal higher in good fats, you're going to feel fuller longer. And that's a good thing as well. In the past, I typically got confused when it came to fats, like good versus bad. I'm talking like years ago, when you kind of like peripherally hear that this is a good fat or a bad fat. So like I always wondered like, well, why can I eat gobs of olive oil, but I'm not allowed to eat fried foods? Like, what's the difference? It's fat is fat, right? I have now since figured out an easy way to remember what's good and what's bad. It's basically, if it's processed at a high temperature, it's likely not to be good for your body. And this is also true for olive oil. I mean, a lot of people use olive oil at high temperatures, and when you do that, you're changing the chemical structure of the oil into something that's not good for you anymore. So things like olive oil should be kept in your salads. I would suggest coconut oil, which you can fry things with at home or whatever, which can handle higher temperatures. But in general, a lot of oils are processed with chemicals and with heat, and you're going to want to stick with the minimally processed fats. So I typically keep butter, olive oil, and coconut oil on hand, and I think you can do most everything with those three things in your kitchen. So let's move on to inflammation. The first speaker we had this week was Dr. Barry Sears, and you might have heard his name because he is the creator of the Zone Diet, which was published in the 90s. His 25-minute lecture was packed with information about the body and inflammation. I will link several videos to talks by Barry Spears on YouTube. His lectures are really easy to understand, and I really urge you to go watch them because honestly, everything in his 25-minute lecture was important to hear, but I cannot repeat the whole lecture in the podcast. So I'm just going to go through the highlights. So let's start off with the point of his topic is all chronic diseases are linked to inflammation. And this is becoming more and more well-known and an established theory, not even a theory, I guess. It's been proven that a lot of chronic diseases like obesity, like heart disease, Alzheimer's, allergies, arthritis, things like that are all linked to inflammation. Now, inflammation is important. It is a natural part of our body, but he explains how inflammation can be detrimental. So let me start with this. So, inflammation needs to be kept in a certain zone. This is kind of why I guess he called it the zone diet. So let's stick with his terminology here. And so if we don't have enough inflammation we won't heal properly. So whether the inflammation is from a microbial invasion or an injury, if we don't have enough inflammation, we won't heal, right? We'll just get sicker. However, if we have too much inflammation, then we attack our own body. This is kind of autoimmune diseases, okay, like rheumatoid arthritis. And so it's important that we need to keep inflammation in the right zone. And we can do this with our diet, okay? So I mentioned already two things that turn on inflammatory responses. So microbial invasion and injuries are two things that turn it on. But the third thing that can turn on inflammatory responses is your diet, certain types of foods, okay? Now, there are two phases of inflammation. You have on and you have off. So typically an event happens like you get a splinter or you bump your arm and the inflammation turns on. And then at some point there is enough of a response and a trigger to turn it off. So the gene transcription factor, and I'm getting into the deep sciencey bits here, the gene transcription factor called nuclear factor kappa B is really the master switch for inflammation, okay? And in our diet, there are things that will turn that on. Some of those are what I've already mentioned is omega-6 fatty acids. Corn oil, soybean oil, sunflower oil, and safflower oil are the main triggers, or the main vehicles of omega-6 fatty acids in Western diets. And all of those things will turn inflammation on in the body. Saturated fatty acids also turns on inflammation, but doesn't mess with cardiovascular issues. So this is where we're getting into some fats are good-ish, but still not great-ish, okay? And the last thing that turns on the inflammatory switch is excess carbohydrates. Now, there are dietary things that also turn off the switch. Those are omega-3 fatty acids. And this is why you need to have those omega-3s and omega-6 in the right proportion and ratio. So you get the omega-3s from fish and fish oil. The other thing that you can eat or consume dietary that is polyphenols. And those are basically fruits and vegetables. And polyphenols are the chemicals that give fruits and vegetables their color. Okay. So in this sense, the Dr. Sears is basically coming to a point of let's use food like a drug, right? You have a symptom and typically you take a pill. Well, now if you have a symptom, you can change your diet and you can affect how your body's response is going to be. So let's talk quickly about his zone diet. He had, of course, lots more information in here, but just quickly, I want to point out what his zone diet is. And he says it's more like a blueprint, not like a diet, because he's not telling you what to eat or when to eat, and not even how much to eat. He's just saying that when you do eat, divide your plate into 3 sections, make 1/3 of the plate protein, and it can be plant-based protein, animal-based protein, it doesn't matter. And 2/3 of the plate, colorful carbohydrates. And then on top of that, a little bit of fat, like olive oil, avocado, or nuts. And just don't eat as many grains and starches. Like just keep those at a very, very minimum. And that's the basics of the Zone diet in like 10 seconds. I think it's pretty easy if you try to do that. And I think for somebody who's looking for an easy switch without too many rules and regulations, but that would have a real impact on your body, this might be something for you to try. I don't even think you need to buy the book. I'm sure you could just go online and look it up. So in addition to what you eat, you could supplement with some anti-inflammatory supplements, and that's basically what I already said, omega-3 fatty acids and polyphenols, both of which you can find at a health food store or online. And there's lots of different kinds of polyphenols. In general, try to get a mix. They're really good for you. So try to add some of those into your diet. Polyphenols are basically super antioxidants. It's hard to get a lot of these because in fruits and vegetables, they're in low concentrations, and also your body doesn't absorb them very well. So they're very good for you, but it's hard to keep them in your system. So the whole point of his talk was just that if you can boil it down to one sentence is, or let's say two sentences, diet can turn on and off inflammatory genes. And he quoted Hippocrates, "Let food be your medicine and let medicine be your food." So like I mentioned, I will put links to a couple of different talks I found from him on YouTube, and I encourage you to go check those out. Our next speaker was Dr. Walter Willett. This presentation was not as easy to understand as Dr. Barry Sears. It was just chock full of graphs and studies, and at some point it was difficult even for me as a chemical engineer to follow him. You know, sometimes you just zone out when you see all of these numbers and graphs, and yeah. So he did include some very nice summary slides that kind of brought the points back together again. But it was so difficult that the school, IIN, prefaced this lecture with an intro to emphasize what the big picture was. And they said, keep in mind, the big picture is the important role that diet has on development and prevention of disease. Normally, they don't introduce lectures, so that can kind of give you an idea of how difficult this lecture was to follow. So let me take you through a high-level look at the conclusions from all the studies. And I should mention that Dr. Walter Willett is a professor of epidemiology and nutrition at Harvard School of Public Health, and he's an author. Of course, they're all authors. So his first point was to say most diseases are not inevitable, meaning that genetics play a minor role, but diet is a much more powerful indicator than genetics, which I think is coming now to be more of the forefront of what people are thinking. And the way that he can demonstrate this is that when you have a study on a population of people with a certain level of cardiovascular disease or whatever diseases they're studying, and then that person immigrates to another location where the diet is different, they will adapt the outcomes of the place where they moved. So if they were living in Crete in Greece and having this super awesome healthy lifestyle, and then they decided they wanted to move to the US, they would adopt all the US chances and risks of health problems. So this is really where it's showing that the diet is much more powerful than where the people are coming from and their genetics. So he did some, like I said, it was a lot of studies, so I'm just going to summarize. He has a high-level summary of how fats, fruits and vegetables, and carbohydrates all play a role in disease prevention and disease promotion. So I'm going to start with fats. And so basically coronary heart disease rates can be dramatically reduced by nutritional means. So And that was part of that study that said, don't eat saturated fat, eat more carbohydrates, which has been proven completely wrong. So that was one of the summaries. One of the points is that you will not achieve a reduction in coronary heart disease by replacing saturated fat with carbohydrates. Just replace saturated fat with anything else but carbohydrates. So, and he also wanted us to avoid or get rid of the recommendation of like how much percentage of calories or energy we should be getting from fat, and also getting away from the negative or pejorative connotations to fat or fatty foods, right? We shouldn't be eating low fat stuff. Just fat is not bad. Unfortunately, that's been drilled into our brain for the last 50 years. So we have to get out from underneath that. The last thing he mentioned about fats, and this is kind of going back to when I first talked about fats at the beginning of the episode. So dietary fat should focus on replacing saturated and trans fats with vegetable oils or other sources of omega-3 fatty acids. So then he went on to summarize fruits and vegetables. So a lot of people are like, yay, fruits and vegetables. I eat all the fruits and vegetables. I'm never going to get cancer, which is not true. So when you have a study, you have to take the good with the bad, right? So the study that he talked about demonstrated that a high intake of fruits and vegetables during your adult life is really going to have a modest to no impact on the overall risk for cancer. Okay? However, that's only one major disease. High intake of fruits and vegetables does reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. And because it's due to, because it's got more potassium and more folate, which is helpful for the cardiovascular system. So just because the study comes out that says fruits and vegetables don't have a big impact on cancer doesn't mean you shouldn't be eating fruits and vegetables. It just means you should be eating fruits and vegetables for something else. So I like the fact that there was some back and forth there in terms of not everything is great for everything. The last thing he summarized was carbohydrates. So like dietary fat, basically you want to think about the quality of the carbohydrate that you're eating rather than the percentage of overall calories. Okay? So you could eat one piece of Wonder Bread in the day and perhaps stay on a ketogenic diet, or if you say, but that one piece of Wonder Bread is not a good quality carbohydrate. Now, a whole head of broccoli, that's a good quality carbohydrate because there's a lot of other stuff going on in there. So keep in mind, it's all about the quality of the fat. It's all about the quality of the carbohydrate. Okay? So then also, there is a lot of, in the U.S., how whole grains are going to help with coronary heart disease. And so consuming grains in the form of high fiber, whole grains, does reduce risk of type 2 diabetes and coronary heart disease. But an intake of refined grains will increase the risk of those diseases. So there's a very fine line there. You have to be very careful with what you're eating. If it is, a caramel colored refined grain bread that looks whole, but it's not, is different than really eating a whole wheat bread. Okay? And that's what they're saying here. Also, obviously, high intake of refined starch and sugar is also problematic when you're talking about insulin resistance, which I'm hoping everybody knows nowadays. And I think it should go without saying, but I'll finish out his lecture by saying a reduction of soda and other sugary beverages should be the highest priority. If you do nothing else in your life to make yourself healthier is to just stop drinking soda, then you'll be great, So the next speaker is the author of the book Real Food, Nina Plankett. I'm not sure if I said that right. Plankett. So Nina is not a doctor. She is a food writer. She's a farmer's market entrepreneur, and she advocates for traditional food. Her lecture was about real food versus industrial food. Real food are, as it sounds, real food. So fish, fruits, vegetables, nuts, whole grains, beef, milk, whatever. And industrial food is sugar, white flour, fats, polyunsaturated vegetable oils, trans fats. So the first thing she talked about was cultural differences. And I think out of her whole lecture, this was the one thing that interested me the most was there was a study done between the cultural differences between France and the U.S. on the view of food. Now, men and women from France typically don't think about eating low fat or the long-term health effects from their diet. But despite the fact that they don't think about those things, they generally see themselves as healthy. On the flip side of that, men and women from the U.S. typically think way more about eating low fat. They always think about the long-term effects on their health, and they don't consider eating as an important pleasure in life, which obviously the French do. Eating is very important in France. And then the kicker is that men and women in the U.S. don't see themselves as healthy. So it is so weird, the idea, the pressure that you put on yourself for eating, and then in the end, you also just don't think you're healthy. So that was one interesting fact or presentation. The other thing that I thought she did really well was, and I mentioned it before in the fat part section, is really understanding the quality of the fats. So if you're going to eat an animal fat, really look at the diet of the animal. What did the animal eat? And you'll hear a lot of people say, eat grass-fed beef, eat grass-fed butter, eat grass-fed milk. Well, that's because when an animal is eating grass instead of grain, they're going to pump up those really good fats in their system and in their product when it comes out. And vegetable fats, you want to look at the processing. How was it made? Was it high processed and high heats and chemicals, or was it minimally processed? So keep those two things in mind. The last thing I took away from her presentation was, and something I never really thought about before, is soy. Now, I think of tofu as tofu, soy, so tempeh, whatever. But what she points out is that a lot of the soy-based products, even tofu and tempeh, in Western areas are way more processed and way more industrial than traditional soy products in Asia. So I thought that was interesting, and I want to look more into that topic. Otherwise, I don't believe I learned too many new or insightful things from her lecture, but, you can't learn something new in every single lecture. So I'm hoping somebody else got more from her lecture than I did. So let's move on to the dairy debate. Dairy. So a lot of diets now are advocating to remove dairy from your diet. And IIN teaches biodiversity. And if you've been listening to my podcast so far, I've talked about biodiversity, and this is the theory that everyone is different and everyone reacts differently to food. So you cannot have a one-size-fits-all diet or regime for everyone. So one person can process and really thrive with dairy, while another person will need to stay next to a bathroom when it comes to dairy. So there are some potential benefits and concerns about dairy. So let's start with the benefits. Dairy may help reduce the risk of high blood pressure. Also, calcium is fundamental to our building blocks of our bones. And it's a really good source, high quality source in dairy of calcium. Also, research has shown that dairy may help reduce the risk of colon cancer when used in moderation. Calcium can also help maintain a healthy pH level, offsetting meats and other things which maybe usually take the body to more of an acidic area. And lastly, an adequate intake of calcium could lessen your symptoms of PMS, premenstrual syndrome. But on the other side of this, it's been said high consumption of full-fat dairy can increase risk of acne, especially in teens. Many milk drinkers could be lactose intolerant, but don't have it diagnosed yet. And also, men who consumed high levels of dairy have a significant increased risk for prostate cancer. So on one hand, it can lower the risk of colon cancer, but also can increase the risk of prostate cancer. So there's balance there. And also there's the synthetic hormones like recombinant bovine growth hormone, which is given to cows to increase their dairy production. So bottom line is you need to figure out how dairy works for you. If you're wondering how to do that, try a short-term elimination diet like the Whole30, where you remove dairy from your diet for 30 days and then add it back in slowly to see what effects it has on you. I'm personally struggling with dairy at the moment, mostly because I use dairy as a default for many meals, really then limiting my nutrients. I don't believe that I have really any adverse effects except when eaten in large quantities like fondue. But for now, I have replaced milk with almond milk for my coffee, and I'm very happy with that switch. The last topic in Module 8 was creative expression. So IIN teaches the theory of primary food and secondary food. Secondary food is the fuel for your body, what you eat. Primary food is fuel for your soul and your mind. And there are 4 main areas of primary food. Those are career, physical activity, relationships, and spirituality. IIN puts these 4 things together plus 8 more things on a circle of life. So a little circle graph looks like a pie chart, right? Creativity is one of those additional 8 things that contribute to a healthy life. So first, we learned what the IIN definition was for creativity. Simply put, it's the ability to create things. And this definition really opens up creativity to people that are not musically or artistically inclined, which most people generally think of when you mention creativity. So what does creativity have to do with health coaching and wellness? They said that creativity or acts of creating things builds new neurological pathways, and it also improves your ability to understand other people. And those 2 things are important to have a healthy, well-rounded life. They said it's kind of like what exercising does for your body, being creative does for kind of your life energy, like your brain balance. So after establishing what creativity means, we listened to Julia Cameron, an artist, poet, playwright, filmmaker, composer, and the author of the book, The Artist's Way. Her lecture primarily focused on her technique called morning pages. This is the act of writing 3 full-page, long-handed journals, basically, every morning. The idea is to get everything out of your brain and onto paper, unfiltered, unapologetic, and with no excuses. She talked about how we are taught that we have a certain limit when it comes to our creativity, but that you can break through those limits with this method of morning pages. Since this episode is already long enough, I'm just going to leave a link to her website where you can watch a 2-minute video of her explanation of morning pages. I have other tools that I have used basically to accomplish the same thing. I typically once a month perform a mind sweep where I just sit with a blank page and write anything that comes into my mind. This way it's kind of out of my head and I can also choose how to process it. I urge everyone to do a mind sweep on a regular basis, whether that means kind of like every night before you go to sleep, you had a pad of paper and you write down everything in your brain, or once a week. Okay, that's it for Module 8. Next week in Module 9, we will learn all about protein and the power of self-care. So if you're interested in learning more about how to start becoming a health coach, or if you have questions for me, email me at becomingahealthcoach@gmail.com. Also check out my website, mybestself.fit, for more articles on health-related topics. And until next time, stay strong and stay healthy. Bye-bye. And then he quoted Hippocrates. He quoted Hippocrates. And I should mention that Dr. Walter Willett is a professor. Hey, you're still listening. Great. Okay, now I can tell you about my 12-week goal setting session. So in this 1-hour session, I'm going to help guide you through a powerful process inspired by the best-selling book, The 12-Week Year. I know. Everybody at this time of the year starts to think about year-long goals. And I would argue that year-long goals are really hard to contextualize. What is going to be happening in a year from now? You have no idea. But 12 weeks gives you a little bit better understanding because you kind of already have your calendar booked out for the next 12 weeks, kind of know what's going to be going on. So if you can focus your goals on the next 12 weeks, you can make some really big actionable steps towards your long-term vision. So in this 1-hour session, we do talk about long-term vision. We talk about where you want to be. We talk about what your 5-year, 10-year, 3-year, all those goals are. But that's only a brief part. We know we see the long distance view, but let's break that down. And then we get into the 1 to 3 strategic 12-week goals that are going to get you to those long-term vision. Then we're going to put that into a really cool action plan with like checklists and timing and all that jazz to make sure that you are clear and that you have accountability to get those goals done. And then that's not it. Then we are going to tackle your roadblocks because you know you have roadblocks. So we're going to tackle those roadblocks. We're going to create a plan to overcome them. So you know when you start to self-sabotage, you know what you can do to get around those roadblocks. Okay, so if this is interesting for you, it is only 1 hour of your time and it's only 45 Swiss francs. I host this gig over on Fiverr, but I'm also going to put a link down in the show notes. So if you're interested, hit me up.